Today I'm going to walk you through one of the sketchbooks that I just finished recently. Sketchbooks play a really important part in my practice. You know, I use them for experimenting, I use them for trying out ideas, I use them for documenting and recording so that I can remember a place. Remember it in terms of a kind of physical bodily memory, as well as a kind of record of the sensation or energy of a place. So I rely very heavily on my sketchbooks for that. My sketchbooks get very beat up. They get thrown into backpacks, they ride around in the car with me, they get dropped into lakes and the mud, and they get rained on. So I'm pretty rough on them. I have a lot of expectations, so you can see from this one, it's pretty beat up. It's pretty dinged up. And especially when you think that I just started this sketchbook in January, it's had a lot of hard use. I like sketchbooks to have good quality paper in them. I usually buy watercolor sketchbooks. When I buy sketchbooks, I often make my own sketchbooks because it's just a lot cheaper. This particular sketchbook has, I think this must be about 200 GSM paper. It can take anything that I throw at it. It's pretty robust. And I prefer bound sketchbooks because I find with the way I use them and abuse them, that spiral bound sketchbooks really don't stand up and they actually fall apart, and that drives me bonkers. There are a few themes that run throughout this particular sketchbook. This is the one that is my backpack sketchbook that I take with me when I go places. This particular one, you can see this is back from January. One of the themes I was really exploring was really trying to leverage continuous line drawing to push the boundaries of my sketchbook practice. And one of the big challenges when you're working on plein air and out in nature is that nature can be pretty overwhelming. There's a lot of stimulation, there's a lot of stuff to look at. And you can find, or I find, that I can slip back into realism very easily. I can slip back into just documenting reality. And there's actually nothing wrong with that. There's actually a time and place for that in my practice. But I was really looking to use continuous line drawing as a technique to push myself beyond that practice. I can see how tentative I was with using that. It's still it looks very tree-like. This particular drawing is on one of my local go-to hikes. I have 3 or 4 hikes that are pretty close to my house, like within a 10-minute drive of my house. This particular one, there is a little side hike you can go on, and it used to lead to a grove of massive, beautiful old oak trees. However, in the big storms we had a couple of years ago, a lot of those trees fell down. Oak trees are gorgeous. When they grow this incredibly sinuous, curvy forms, and so this was just looking at one of the fallen over trees and the form of the fallen over tree. So in this particular work, unlike the previous work, the previous spread where I was feeling very tentative, I kind of really pushed this one to the max. I really leaned into gesture and just trying to express the energy of the place. This was done, we have a lake locally, a man-made lake where I often go to hike. It's tucked into the most beautiful canyon with oak trees and lots of wildflowers in spring. But again, this was on a grey day in late winter, which you can kind of sense from the kind of dark tonal vibe to it. But just at the edge of the lake, there's a whole series of grasses that I would call bulrushes in Australia. It really captures the energy and the feel for the place. I like the gestural lines. I like how I've used colour in a very kind of loose and abstract way. This was me pushing it to the max before kind of starting to bring it back, and you can see the results of this in this next piece, which is at the same location but on a different day. You can see those grasses featuring here at the edge of the composition. Really just some very expressive use of line, just really leaning into that whole continuous line drawing and what the potential of that was. I really like the kind of economical use of colour. And you can see here the green. This was done in mid-February, so we just had our big winter rains, and so all of the landscape was slowly beginning to turn green and come back to life, which is such a feature of the end of winter and early spring in California. I love the kind of mark making here on the lake, and just generally overall this I feels much more comfortable. A kind of confident and considered use of continuous line to abstract the landscape and just try and get the sense of the lake. You can see that taken even further here where I pushed it a next step, where I'm really enjoying the kind of use of line and very economical use of colour. There's starting to be some mark making in here, and there's just a really nice interplay between the use of the white paper and then the actual mark making to just give that feel of a kind of cold, blustery winter day. And this is where you really start to see me get comfortable with it. So this was actually down at the coast. I love in this composition how I've balanced kind of planes of colour and economical use of planes of colour with this more detailed area that just kind of draws your line down into the scene. This is a particular spot where I draw quite frequently, so it's often an interesting benchmark for me to look back on, and maybe I'll do a video on that. I really like the mark making and the colour and the sense, and I feel like I've really captured a sense of what that particular place is, where you can sit and you look out over the cliffs and to the ocean. And then this one is exploring another of the themes. So one of the themes in this particular sketchbook is continuous line drawing, and then the other one is me really starting to play some more with geometric forms in the environment and how to articulate the interplay between human-made forms that are often very geometric and very square and the kind of more organic forms of nature. And so in this one, there were two man-made structures in this particular view I was looking at, and so I did a continuous line drawing to capture the sense. This is again at the lake, so this is capturing the edge of the lake. Then what I did was took the lines from the man-made structure and used them, and the lake, and used them to create this sort of offbeat grid to divide the composition and to kind of explore the space. I like the visual interest that this creates. I like that I then went back and worked over different sections of that to really emphasize the grid. But then within the grid, you have like the new grass sprouting in the spring and the bright green of that. You have some rocks and marks from the lake, and then some other man-made structure marks kind of appearing in here. I don't really aim to resolve compositions in my sketchbooks. What I'm actually trying to do is to explore ideas, and I try very hard not to feel like they have to become perfect, because as soon as I start to do that, things start to tighten up. So this next one, again, is this a fully resolved composition? I would say no. I gave myself a very challenging composition because the main kind of feature that I had here is an old jetty that sits in the lake that houses the pump for the lake and the reflections of that. And so the composition felt very much like it was kind of squished towards the top edge. And so I played with this quite a lot. You can see I've worked back into it quite substantially to just try and get a sense of connection between those two elements. I love the sort of curvilinear pathway that comes down through here. I love the surface reflections playing on the water here. And then these vertical lines, like the grid, in the previous page, these vertical lines really just start to connect the whole composition together, and we move from them being fairly dark, kind of mimicking the pylons of the jetty, to kind of bright green and spring-like over on this side of the page. This particular one was back at another of the local hikes. This particular location, there was an old tuberculosis sanitarium on the site, which was then demolished. And all that is left are some old stone walls and some roadways through this large park that's now an open space. So in this one, I started with continuous line drawing, so there is some continuous line drawing, and then I really just started to play with the shadows that were falling across the road, and then some of the mark making to show that spring growth. And then there was a stone wall on this side, which has kind of dissolved, which has dissolved into just mark making and geometric mark making. So this one's become very abstract. I like the diagonal flow of the shadows and the color, and I think it is a nice counterpoint to the sweep of the lines through here. I won't dwell on this one. This was just a detail looking at the stone wall, just exploring some mark making and texture and color. And then we went to Yosemite. So the next series of sketches are all taken from our trip to Yosemite, which was in early April. There's a series of different kind of tactics that I'm using. I did a number of tonal drawings. It was very early spring. It was the very first week of April, and we actually had a lot of snow. It actually snowed quite heavily when we were there. We actually were snowed in one day, and just the shadow and the quality of the light and those amazing rocks were all the things that I got super inspired by. We did a hike up to Mirror Lake in the valley. It snowed and snowed and snowed. So these actually weren't done on site. These were done from images afterwards because the conditions were such that we didn't really want to sit around in the snow and sketch. At Mirror Lake, there's this amazing rock that just sits in the middle of the lake, and just the reflections with the trees around it, and just trying to capture the presence of that. So continuous line drawing, very quick sketch here to get my eye in, and then pushed it into a tonal drawing here. This is kind of two different images. So if we focus on this half to start with, this is just looking at the reflections in the lake using continuous line drawing and mark making to just try and capture the feeling. The water up there is the most amazing deep green color, and it's not algae green, it's actually the color of the water is just beautiful. It's definitely a feature of the Sierras. This was taking the rock and just really trying to abstract it. Starting to play with gouache, which is something I've started to do recently. I really enjoy the quality that you get and the layering that you get with gouache. It's really nice counterpoint to watercolor, because watercolor is so transparent and pure color, and then you get this haze effect with the gouache, which is really very beautiful. So this was just abstracting the form of that rock and really pushing it further. A couple more pencil sketches. I think I'm going to do a deeper video because I did do some paintings based on this Yosemite trip, so I will do a deeper video. But again, just tonal explorations. There was a lot of very atmospheric weather effects like fog and cloud drifting around the mountaintops, which was just spectacular and poetic. So this was just capturing that there was a lot of snow still. Like, we had snow while we were there. I think we had over a foot of snow while we were there. So, and then we went hiking in the snow. So just capturing the light on the snow and just really trying to abstract that and play with that as an idea. And then, of course, we did the classic hike to the upper Yosemite Falls, which was really spectacular. Just playing with gouache to get that sense of the water, and then the magnificent colours that are in those granite cliffs. Just really spectacular and spectacularly beautiful. There's a lot of water coming over the falls because of the snow melt. Just exquisite. And then we're back home again. So this is back up at our local lake, you know, really just trying to be super loose in my approach. So continuous line drawing. You can see those grasses that I come back to repeatedly over and over again, and just playing with colour. So capturing the colour, using some different hues to really get a sense of the shadow and the light, the sunlight and the spring growth. And then we're back to Yosemite again with these two. So again, as I said, another theme that I've really been pushing in this sketchbook is man-made structures in the natural environment. And so these were just a couple of sketches that I did to just kind of get my hand in and get my eye in and get me thinking about that. This one is the gatepost for the R1E hotel. This is a beautifully built stone structure that just is kind of fairly randomly sitting in the middle of this beautiful forest up there, and it's an interesting contradiction between the two. And then on the last day on our way back, we actually went up to Tioga Road and actually hiked. So we hiked the Sequoia Grove Nature Loop. In summer I probably wouldn't do, but in winter it was just covered in snow and absolutely gorgeous. The Sequoia Grove Trail follows the old highway, what was the original highway into Yosemite, and at some point someone cut down one of the big sequoia trees and then cut a big hole in the middle of it so people could actually drive a stagecoach through the center of the tree. I was fascinated by that man-made intervention into this grove of the most beautiful ancient trees. I just wanted to capture that in this sketch. At the end of April, we actually took a trip to Southern California and we headed back to Palm Springs, to Joshua Tree, and of course another visit to the Salton Sea. And I talk a lot about the Salton Sea in my previous video where I talk about some of the work that I've been doing that's inspired by the Salton Sea. But this particular work was done in Joshua Tree. I did the most fantastic hike to the Los Palms Oasis. A friend of mine recommended it to me. It was a fantastic recommendation. It was the most spectacular hike, walking through valleys and over hills of the most wonderful blobby rocks. I sat down, I had some lunch and did this very, very quick 5-minute sketch of some of the rocks there. I really like this. I think it's really nice. I love how loose and free and expressive it is, and I love how it articulates that place and the energy of that place so well. We also took a hike in Anza Borrego Park, which I have not been to before, so this was a new one for me. We did the Slot Canyon hike, which was the most spectacular hike, and then this wasn't done on site, this was done from a photograph of some of the sandstone formations, the most amazing rock formations just from that. And this is also me really starting to leaning into using gouache and a mixture of gouache and watercolor much more. But I really like this. Again, I think it really captures the feeling and sensation of being in that place. And then this is another one that was done from the Slot Canyon hike. All the folds in the rock were just gorgeous, and then there was this one amazing place where there was actually a rock that was caught in the center of that. And so just, you know, playing with the sensations of being on that hike and walking through those narrow spaces. There are a few places where you had to just really squeeze through, really exploring that as an idea. And again, you can see the continuous line drawing being used to build the structure, which I then worked back into. And then the Salton Sea. I took a hike in the sunny Bono Nature Reserve, and then I climbed up the rock and you could actually see across the fields. And this kind of, to me, this really articulates a lot of the contradictions that make up the Salton Sea and why the Salton Sea is so fascinating to me. As I mentioned, I have a whole video that's looking at some aspects of that. You were in the middle of the desert, you have the Salton Sea on the horizon. It was very hazy because there was some wildfire smoke. To get to the Sunny Bono Wildlife Reserve, you have to drive through irrigated acres of farmland that, you know, and the hay had just been cut. It was very green. And my view from where I was standing on top of this rock was of these ploughed paddocks, and just trying to capture the sense of the mark making of the ploughed paddocks. There was a tractor that was still working the fields down there, so I could hear the sound. I was out in nature, there were tons of birds, but I could hear the sound of a tractor ploughing the fields ready for the next set of crops. And just the contradiction between that and being in the desert, and just the idea of the ploughing as being almost like a form of drawing. So just trying to capture that and using texture to try and capture that. And this is introducing some other media as well. After going to Palm Springs, we headed across to Tucson and stayed out near the Rincon Mountains. And there's this very quick sketch. One morning, was very early as the sun was coming up, and the light was just catching the mountains in the most spectacular way. And so I leaned into the colours that I was seeing, so really using the bright colour of where the light was catching the texture on the hills, using continuous line drawing and mark making and drawing back into that, and then contrasting that with the deep, deep, dark shadows. So it was very high contrast, and I decided to go complementary and introduce this purpley colour for the shadows. One of the things, I talked about the Lost Palms Oasis, but one of the amazing things on that hike was hiking across the southern part of Joshua Tree and then coming across this view of the Salton Sea. So you can see the Salton Sea here, and looking across these rock-strewn mountains to the Salton Sea in the distance with the hills of the Anza Borrego Park behind them. Just exploring that, exploring mark making. This is very landscapey, and I would say these three are really just about capturing what I was seeing and what I was experiencing in the environment. I think there's a lot of very beautiful things here. There's a lot of things in here, a lot of mark making and building up of layers that I'll definitely take into different works. But really just wanting to capture the sensation of walking over a ridge and then just having this view with the Salton Sea in the distance. And then having done several spreads where leaning much more towards traditional representation while still very abstracted, I then pushed myself to experiment and push that further, and to really see, because, you know, with the landscape you definitely have a sense of the horizon that runs through them. So really just trying to disrupt that horizon a little bit and just trying to capture the energy a little more and some of the mark making and some of the texture. Again, exploring different media, working back, so using Sumi ink and then working back into that with oil pastel on this one. And then this last one was really starting and drawing from the experience of being in Desert Shores on the Salton Sea. So Desert Shores was intended as a kind of canal development where you would have a whole series of homes on the canal and people could tie their boats up and then take their boats out to the sea. However, so much of it's evaporated and so you could literally not get a boat through here. And there are just stumps of pylons and broken bricks, and it's really emblematic of how the sea is evaporating and how the changes that have happened to it over time, to the environment. If you want to learn more about that, watch my previous video. But this was taken from a charcoal sketch that I did, which is hanging on the wall behind me. I don't think you can quite see it. And so, which I think I'm going to work up into a bigger painting. So this was just exploring and playing with what are some of the colours and textures that I might want to introduce into this. So this is almost like a study in a way. And that's actually the last page, apart from some scribbles. That's actually the last page in this book. So I hope you've enjoyed this walkthrough of the sketchbook, of my sketchbook, and me talking about some of the influences and some of the things that have found their way and some of the things that I've tried to work on. Thank you so much for watching. Please like and subscribe. I am trying to grow my channel, so I really appreciate the subscriptions. I'll see you in the next one. Take care. Bye for now.